Namaste to all. Welcome to Clyde Samvada, brought to you by the Hindu Temple of Scotland. We all know that the Scottish elections is coming up next week. And in regard to that, we were recently doing a hustings at the temple. And as part of the preparation to that, I happened to read the Scottish Hindu Manifesto. And Ravi ji, who is joining us today for Clyde Samvada, is one of the co-authors of that Scottish Hindu Manifesto. When I read through that, one of the striking points from the manifesto was the thinking of a Dharmic framework that we could bring into how the Scottish economy and polity could really engage with. And that I found to be an extremely interesting thread, which overlaps with some of the previous discussions that we've had within Clyde Samvada, be it in terms of the intersection between economy and Hinduism, or be it the intersection between technology and Hinduism. And I thought it was a very interesting thread that we should definitely pick up in the lead up to the elections next week, so that we have a manifesto-oriented input that we could potentially bring in from the Hindu philosophical thinking into Scottish. So in that regard, Ravi ji, welcome to Clyde Samvada. How are you doing?
Namaste. Thank you for having me. It's been a journey to get here, so thank you very much for having us.
So maybe we kind of start with the thinking on what led you to think about this Dharmic framework to Scotland, and why now?
So first of all, the function of a manifesto is to present ideas and present solutions to problems that exist within society. Now, Scottish Hindus have been a part of what we say the tartan of Scotland for many, many decades now. And we are now in a position where, as a community, we're organized and we're structurally there to a point where we can now start contributing in other ways, as opposed to just doing festivals and smaller events.
Yeah.
And the other element of it is that the things that happen outside of our homes and our mandirs have a direct impact to our mandirs and our homes. So it doesn't make any sense for us not to be engaged. Now, in that engagement, the question that was posed is, do we have any ideas of our own? And what does our culture, civilization, traditions say about said problems? In many, many discussions into the wee hours of the night with lots of people, what became very apparent is that Hindus have a unique way of seeing the world. And in order to diagnose a problem or to diagnose or come up with a solution that's inherently Hindu in its kind of essence, we needed a framework. Now, a framework within a manifesto is what we call organized logic. So you've diagnosed a problem, okay, how have you seen that problem? Where has that problem come from? And then naturally, where does the solution come from? So the Dharmic framework is a encapsulation of Dharmic thought in a framework that can be applied to problem solving in its basic sense. So obviously there's the famous line from Gangapurta Bhishma in the Mahabharata, which is, anything that's within the Mahabharata exists in the universe, and if it's not in the Mahabharata, it's not in the universe. So we said, okay, let's see what we can pull together. And one of the key things that came out of it is in the Karna Parva. There's a very famous conversation that Krishna, or discourse that Krishna gives, which is the definition of Dharma. And so we started with that. Okay, now we've got a solid definition from the Mahabharata on what Dharma is. And when we looked at society as a whole, the whole kind of essence of the Mahabharata, Ramayana, and these kind of itihasas is the re-establishment of Dharma, where adharma has kind of taken root. So we thought, okay, the Hindu worldview says that, we can use entropic kind of thought process where, there's a decline and there's an upswing, and, there's an upswing and a decline, and things move in cycles. So if society moves in cycles, then where does Hinduism come into this, and where can we offer solutions? So we came up with, based on what Krishna says in the Mahabharata and other elements of Hindu thought, whether it's Sankhya philosophy, whether it's Advaita Vedanta, we came up with a framework that we could apply and distill solutions from based on Dharmic thinking. And that's what Dharmic framework is. And it's literally the opening of the manifesto out explaining what Dharma is and how this tool is supposed to be used.
Super interesting, Raviji. So one is the definition and the philosophy. Now, how do
Sure.
we kind of go from definition and philosophy into practice, right? Like, I mean, how do we translate that to a Scottish type setting?
Sure. So again, the Mahabharata and Ramayana and other Hindu texts come up with the solution to this. So if we take the Bhagavad Gita as a very simple example of this, there's the 18 chapters of the the Bhagavad Gita, and Krishna then doesn't say, okay, now you've heard everything, that's it. Still that's the understanding is that the Bhagavad Gita and the discourse is at the start of the war. Arjun still has to go and win the war.
Yeah.
Right, so there's an action orientated and a task orientated function of the discourse that Krishna is speaking. Now, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita in isolation, it may not be discernible from that. Now, when you look at it from within the context of the Mahabharata and what happens next and what's happened before, you get a very, very striking, not discourse, but kind of call to action is the best way I can describe it. That, okay, now that you've found your Dharma, what are you going to do with it? And again, there's a very famous conversation between Krishna and Karan, where Karan is lamenting his life and how difficult he's had it. And then Krishna turns around to him and says, well, people have been trying to kill me whilst I was in my mother's womb. Do you want to swap lives? So, and it provides a perspective where, okay, Dharma doesn't stop, karma doesn't stop, none of these things are stopping. And then obviously when Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that, look, none of these things are ever going to stop. They have been going on so many times. You've been here before. I've been here before. The only thing that you're in control of is your actions, right? Even after your action is done, you're not, again, it's the famous quote, which is that, you don't get the fruits from the
Fruits
action.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we thought, okay, there's something about Hinduism that needs to be applied. So what we kind of discussed is that Hinduism needs to shift from this philosophical standpoint back to what Krishna and the other kind of Hindu texts talk about, which is this action-orientated function, that you don't exist in a vacuum, and that it's your dharma, whatever dharma you find yourself in, whether it's karma yogi, a gyan yogi, whatever it may be, there is an action-orientated function behind it. So it's our dharma to contribute solutions to the suffering and the issues that we see in the country that we are in. Now, people can make a distinction between dharma bhumi and karma bhumi. Okay, that's fine, and that's a different conversation. But irrespective of, there are Hindus in Scotland that have been here all their lives, and this would be then classed as their dharma bhumi. Now, again, they have a distinct view of seeing the world. They have a distinct view of problem solving. So we've encapsulated that and said, this is how Hinduism would solve this particular problem using the Dharmic framework and the examples that have been set out in the entirety of Hindu literature, which is go forth, be intrepid, go and help people where you can find it, do seva. And that's what we've kind of distilled from our learnings.
Super, Vijay. So, from the reading of the manifesto, couple of things was really striking for me.
Okay.
One is the discussion around the wealth fund.
Sure.
Can you kind of take us a bit into that? Because if we look at where Scotland is, one of the key stress is the stress of physical pressures, right? So be it university sector, be it general finances, all of it is having a certain degree of stress. So maybe go deeper into that particular concept and the thinking from a dharmic link to that concept, and then deeper about the concept itself.
Sure. So the first thing that we did is we evaluated the current state of Scottish finances and the Scottish economy, what's working, what isn't. And, we've highlighted things like film and TV that are, doing amazing things,
Yeah.
But we've also highlighted other areas like oil and gas where it's not so great. And there are pressures on different parts of Scotland with, an industry that in some instances isn't being supported, and in some instances it is being supported. So there's a kind of give and go happening. We took all of it in entirety and we said, okay, well, applying the Dharmic framework, what's actually happened? And then what we've distilled from that is lots of short-term decision making. So, and what we've said is that the dharmic view of this is, well, okay, you've seen a multiple series of short-term decisions, and they've all, into some degree, have backfired. You now need to come out of that cycle. So you're not making short-term decisions that, after 5 years, you're in either a deeper hole or a different hole. We then looked and said, okay, well, has anybody ever had this problem before? And we went through Hindu history, we looked at different kind of individual figures, and then we settled on Chanakya. So we evaluated Chanakya, and we sat with the Arthasastra and the Chanakya Niti. And one of the key things that came out of it was this particular conversation that's referenced in the manifesto between Chanakya's father, Acharya Chanak, and on his visit to Pataliputra, because Chanakya is originally from Dakshila. So in this conversation, it transpires that a young adolescent, Chanakya, who's with his father, is asked what his thought process or what his feeling is on a Raja's policy towards taxation. And Chanakya, taking a minute to think about it, says, well, a Raja should tax his people like a honeybee collecting nectar from a flower, takes what it needs without disturbing the rest of the flower. So we took this and said, well, coupled with the short-term decision-making, the government needs to find an alternative source of revenue. So we looked around the world and said, well, hold on, Norway's got a sovereign wealth fund, Singapore's got one, and many other countries have these things. So why can't Scotland have one? And then slowly, piece by piece, we began putting together ideas of how could we fund this wealth fund, again, without raising taxes. Because again, it's Chanakya's lesson, which is, he says, again, I think in the Chanakya Niti, which is you can't milk a dry udder. It hurts, it hurts the cow and you don't get nothing for it. And there's other kind of thought processes that Chanakya has on taxation and the role of government and, in his understanding, monarchy. So we then applied this Dharmic framework and came up with a Scottish wealth fund. And the way to fund it would be through Scotland's energy surpluses and what's going to be potentially happening in the future, which is data becoming the new oil. Now, for those that don't know, Scotland is home of the spaceport, and lots of industries are going to be springing up in and around it, on top of, gaming being a huge industry in Scotland, and the infrastructure being, so, I mean, I think Scotland has some wonderful infrastructure when it comes to internet and data and things like that. The colder climate certainly helps with data centers. But again, within the manifesto, we've planned for data centers being in space. And we've said that, okay, in the eventuality that data centers go in space, how do we keep still feeding the wealth fund through data? And we've come up with a data dividend, which is that all the companies use our data, and at the moment, there's no cost for it. So if we put a cost on for using our data and other, mapping data, or we've said, logistical data, so much data gets poured out of a country. If we monetize that and even took a small cut of it and then invested it, it's raising funds without taxing the people. So when we did, again, in our own rudimentary way, when we did all the math together, we estimated that somewhere between 45 to 50 billion could be generated by 2050 without raising a single penny of tax. Now, that would pay comfortably for our entire National Health Service and pay comfortably for education. It would fix all the roads. It's just having that additional revenue without taxing. And that's where the Scottish Wealth Fund came from Chanakya back in the 1st century. And using our Dharmic framework.
Yeah, that's a very nice arc of how you connected it, right? Like it's the cow example, the bee and honey example. So taking those metaphors to anchor it to this was super interesting in how you presented that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for doing that. And in fact, some of our own research that we have kind of done in the university, which is kind of focused around digital commons, we have again sort of articulated similar types of things. So data commons is one, there could be other types of commons. And having this sort of community-based assets and infrastructure as a way of leveraging innovative financing sources is definitely a very strong way of thinking about it. And to a large extent, it's also that Scotland has a history in this. I mean, Scotland is probably one of the few countries which has the community wealth building agenda. So the thinking is there. It's just that to a large extent, that thinking has been in pilot stage or in a few pockets here and there.
Yeah.
You have this one-off Isle of Giga trust with a few windmills in there, and that becomes a community asset. So this combination of renewable energy and data, as is sort of put in the manifesto, I think is a super powerful combination to really think deeper of community assets and monetization of that and using that for public value creation. So I hope that's an idea that definitely gets picked up by the new government coming in.
We've seen tweets and we've seen social media comments, and again we've held 15 hustings across the country, and we haven't had a single objection from a single party yet. So the idea is there, and what it requires is willpower to get it over the line. It's taking the decision making out of the political cycle, that you're having a much long-term vision of your nation and your people effectively, that we don't know what the future problem may be, but because we've got this pot of money, there is an element of insulation. Now, money isn't the solution to every problem, but it's better to have it and not need it, and need it and not have it. The other element of it is that it fits really well into the Scottish philosophy and the way Scotland sees the world. For most people that don't know, Scotland practically invented the modern world. Like the amount of research and development that Scotland is responsible for, or Scottish people are responsible for, would astound most people. Everything from the TV to the radio to
Kelvin to James Watt. Yeah.
Indeed, yes. So Dolly the sheep cloning, it was there. So this kind of dharmic model of uplifting society, being invested in research and development, it intimately ties with how Scottish people and Scottish history sees itself. And this is where we thought, no, we're similar in this regard. And we thought, it was a really good bridge to, build with the local community and the public services going forwards in the future. The intention is that Hindus contribute more meaningfully. Outside of being the doctors, lawyers, engineers of the world, contributing with something like Dharma, which its function is to uplift society. We don't have no compulsion on who we're uplifting, as long as a soul and an atma is uplifted. That's where punya is, as far as Hindu text and literature is concerned. And we thought, okay, at least in there where decision making is concerned, and that's what we class as the political arena, we have something to say, and this is how we're saying it in the language of our ancestors and our civilization.
Super. And the second strand of thought, which again struck me very deeply in the manifesto, is that intersection between AI and Dharma, right? So the first is more of an economic oriented decision making. Now sort of moving on to the technology dimension in some way. Within Clyde Samvada itself, we have had multiple prior episodes where we have kind of looked at AI and Hinduism. We have looked at heritage tech startups, which are sort of building on top of AI from a heritage lens. And one of the things that has been a very striking philosophical discussion that we've had around those is how Purusharthas, or the framing around the Purusharthas, could be a way of how AI is sort of looked at. And within that, one element is the Dharma element. And it's sort of like a righteous content being trained on AI is something that's important. So that's a track that we've kind of picked up in a previous conversation. So when I saw that again manifested in the manifesto, I felt like, okay, that's another interesting strand that I should pick your brain on to get more of your thinking on why that, and then what's the Dharmic element to it that you think is striking to how the AI futures look like.
Sure. So I've seen multiple discourses on AI and the impact that it will potentially have, or the concerns around it, whether, you're from a science fiction and envisage a dystopian kind of future, or, a kind of utopia, Elysium kind of future. Irrespective of the outlooks, the core thing that we understood is that AI isn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
Like it's here now, it's arrived, and it's now up to the people, the society, to determine how far it goes and what and where it sits and where it lives. So the conversations that we had in trying to build this manifesto, we projected out and said, well, look, this government is going to be sitting for the next 5 years. What's on the immediate horizon and what's on the horizon after that 5 years? So we said, okay, the big conversation that everyone is discussing right now is AI. I think when we were drafting this, Claude had just come out, and there was obviously conversations with China releasing DeepSeek. And India was gearing up for its own indigenous large language model AIs. So every country was having its symposium, and obviously London had the first one of the first ones with Rishi Sunak and Elon Musk, famously in London.
Yeah.
So we said, look, everybody's talking about this, yet nobody's involving us in the conversation. Now, my other background is a historical researcher. So when I explain my Hindu ideas to other people, giving the example of a cow, for example, why Hindus consider the cow so sacred, it's because Hindus were at the dawn of the agricultural revolution, lifeblood, and it was a life source of many, many Hindu empires and many, many Hindu kingdoms. And therefore, the function of the cow, from an socio-economic standpoint, was that it was able to support a large population. If you look at, where if you can get milk from it, you can turn it into yogurt. If you get yogurt from it, you can turn it into so many other products. Cow manure to fertilize the field, and you can use it to plow. And the socio-economics function of the cow is a hangover from the agricultural revolution. And then when we go down again this historical kind of linear track of all the other revolutions, there's a Hindu presence there at each of these kind of dawns. So we said, well, no, there needs to be a Hindu conversation to this AI dawn that we're about to witness. And we said, what's, again, using our Dharmic framework and projecting out and trying to diagnose problems, we said the problem isn't the physical AI itself, it's the fleshy human bit behind it. That's the problem. And we used three key pieces of information, which is the chapters 2 and 13 from the Bhagavad Gita. We then dove a little bit deeper from what we call the philosophy of Maya, and the kind of conversations that were happening within Hindu literature about what we understood to be Maya, the illusionary world.
Illusion.
And then the other kind of big conversation that we had about was from the Ramayana and the idealized society, right? And what leadership,
that thing.
yeah. So and what lead. So going through those three modes, what we quickly realized is that the same way that the internet was an unknown, that there was no way anybody could have predicted the impact the internet would have, transforming the world, globalization and the rest of it. What impact is AI going to have on people? So Krishna talks about this quite eloquently in verses. So it's chapter 2, verses 60 to 63, which is what happens when the mind becomes bewildered and intelligence is lost, and it leads to poor decision making. Now, we look at what Hinduism is talking about Maya and this illusionary world, that this material presence is, yes, it's there and it's important, but the spiritual underpinnings are, and what we call the Brahman, is far more important in that, in the pursuit of moksha. So you were talking about Purusharthas and, trying to attain moksha, the ultimate goal. What we quickly again distilled was that what AI would do is it would unlock the human imagination. Whatever the mind can conceive, AI would in some near future be able to produce. So, and we're seeing that now with deepfakes and manipulation of evidence and so many other kind of key things that we hold as the truth. So we then said, the battle isn't for AI, the battle is for the truth. So
and the mind in some way.
Yeah, so because again, what Krishna talks about in chapters 13 is that perception shapes reality. So if your perception is twisted and conditioned in a particular way, then that immediately leads to bad decision making. Now, in a business sense, we would call this a value destruction. So if you can imagine at the lower end of or the kind of customer facing end of a business, now if you're getting customer feedback and it's not interpreted correctly or it's not distilled correctly, by the time that information is filtered up the food chain into the CEO, where now market entry strategies are being determined or investment strategies are being determined, but it's all built on this Maya, it's the end.
Yeah.
So this is what we said, that based on the rollout of the internet and its impact, we need to pump the brakes and reevaluate the impact it would have on society and the individual. So our policy was putting in safeguards and putting in at least review at each step of the way to see and measure its impact, whether it's actually having a beneficial impact or a negative impact. So we've seen with Australia and its kind of ban on social media that it's actually having a net positive impact. A lot of the feedback that's coming back from the under 16s is, I didn't realize how much time I had.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
when you look at that conversation and look at what's happening in Hinduism and Hindu literature, that Maya saps not only your Atma, but your sense of yourself, there's something there that needs to be evaluated. So the conversations around AI are usually framed as this kind of cake, which is,
Yeah.
you have the tool at the top, and which is, the icing, and then it filters all the way down to the base, which is the infrastructure. To which we simply said, okay, well, where's the cake sitting? Which table is it on? Who's cutting the cake? All these other side conversations that need to happen about, and because ultimately this tool is going to reshape our society.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we've said, no, if it's going to do it, then it's going to have to be done through this dharmic lens, where we can stop ourselves from doing the negative thing. So yeah, that's how it all came together.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I mean, like, in fact, we were, as part of one of our research, we were talking to one of these startups, and they have in fact taken inspiration from Bhavishya Purana
Okay.
to set guardrails around virtual reality experiences, right? So the classic gaming industry would say, okay, addiction, attention, attention. And here they are, okay, now Bhavishya Purana says, like, okay, you need to have these guardrails around how much you can use and how much is that boundary between getting too addicted and not getting addicted. And so
Yeah.
kind of putting that into the whole philosophy of how the tech development itself happens
Sure.
is something that was kind of striking for us from what we heard. So similar to what you were saying.
Yes. The other kind of story that stuck with us throughout this is from the Garuda Purana, where Narada Muni asks Vishnu, what's the meaning of satsang? Like, what does it do? And Vishnu says, okay, right, I'll teach you. So Vishnu says to Narada Muni, okay, if you go into this forest, there's a insect there. Just go to it and say my name. So Narada Muni, confused, rushes off to this forest, finds this insect, and says Vishnu's name. And next thing, the insect falls over, dies. And rushes back to Vishnu and says, the insect died. And he says, okay, fine. Okay, in this river, there's a fish. Go to it and say my name, and same thing happens, the fish dies. And eventually, Narada Muni works its way up to a child. Now, Narada Muni at this moment is panicked, right? He's like, I can't kill a child. This is not on. What's going on? But Vishnu says, no, trust me, go and I will explain satsang to you. So Narada Muni rushes off, and unfortunately this child dies. But when Narada Muni comes back to Vishnu, there's a Atma there with Vishnu. And Vishnu explains that the purpose of satsang is to hear the truth. When you hear the truth, it sets your soul free. So when we congregate together and we listen to each other's truth, the entire society is uplifted. And so again, this is where we integrated all these kind of thought processes into, okay, what impact does it have on society, and in particularly Satya? Because we say Sat, Chit and Ananda. If you can't get the Chit and Ananda if Satya is so far away from you.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I mean, like, it's absolutely fascinating how you very seamlessly interlace stories to business, to technology, to politics and economics, right? So it's super fascinating how you kind of merge all of that in like almost like so seamlessly. So I think there's definitely follow-up episodes that we should kind
Of
of
course.
have you on to kind of look at these sort of intersections from different storylines. I mean,
But
so
this is
super
the
fascinating.
fascinating thing, which is this is how our ancestors thought.
Yeah.
This is exactly this is their thought process, which is, okay, if we're doing something, we're going to make sure it's the best version of it. And if it fails, it doesn't matter. If it's a good idea, we'll keep experimenting till we get it right. Otherwise, you don't get, the poetry, the Bharatanatyam, the yoga, you don't get any of these things without trial and error. And there needs to be a spirit of it's okay to fail. And our ancestors were comfortable with failure because ultimately it was in pursuit of the truth.
Yeah.
And so the
that's
stories.
a super interesting note to sort of link it to what we sort of discussed overall, right? Which is the fact that, okay, if hopefully the new government comes in and takes some of these ideas, experiments with it, thinks of these as long-term ideas and sort of does this trial and error with it and takes it potentially as like national level strategy beyond just one-off pilots. And
Sure.
let's see if kind of takes up that way. I think that's really what the manifesto was aiming to do, and hopefully some of that will translate post the elections. Let's see.
Yeah, I think from the manifesto's perspective was we have something to say when we have something to contribute outside of being the doctor, lawyers, engineers of the world. That in this particular arena that our ideas are just as valid as anybody else's. The other element of it was that it would be a disservice to our ancestors and our civilization if we didn't organize it in the way that we have, which is so much thought and so much wisdom and so much tapasya is the word I would use, has gone into distilling whether you're Mimamsa, whether you're Advaita Vedanta, it doesn't matter which branch of Hindu philosophy you're on. So much thought and so much bhakti has gone into these things that I don't need to use anybody else's ideas. We don't need to use anybody else's ideas. It's all there. Taking a bit of time to understand and apply it, it's all it takes. And again, as I said, our running joke is that all we're doing is working on applied Hinduism. That's it. So you have mathematics, and then you have applied mathematics. You have Hinduism, you have Sanatana Dharma, then you have applied Sanatana Dharma, and this is it.
Yeah, that's a super nice way of putting it all together. It's sort of like you're not creating anything new. It's sort of like getting it. I mean, because the whole concept of how rishis engaged with mantras is mantras were there. It's just that they kind of evolved it or sort of got it through their meditation and things like that. So that resonance of linking that to how we apply it to current modern day life is a super nice principle of how we think about it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raviji, for joining us for Clyde Samvada. I'm definitely sure that there are follow-up episodes that we will definitely pick up on your thoughts from.
Anytime. And thank you for having us. Thank you for doing this episode. And look forward to the future and all the things that it brings.
Super. Namaste.
Namaste.